Lori.
All right.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to have you join us. Today's webinar is Brand-centric digital activation, and you are with us at the Institute for the Study of Business Markets, and I'm Lynn Yanyo, the Executive Director. So I'm glad that you're all able to dial in, and I'm going to give ourselves a few minutes as everybody gets settled in for this webinar and talk to you a little bit about ISBM before we get started. So just as a visual, since you're going to be mostly in auditory mode and looking at a slide deck, Mitch Duckler is our speaker today, and Mitch is managing partner at Full Surge, and he's going to be speaking to us on this brand. Mitch also has a brand new book that came out last year, the Indispensable Brand, and I'm going to just say out at the outset, you might want to take a look at that. And then quickly, there was me, and we'll just pass that. How we use our interaction here. So as people are interested in asking a question, you all are on mute. So the questions are going to come in the Q&A tab. And so down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see this little file folder that has a Q on it. Click on that and type your question. I'll be looking at their questions as they come in, and I will field them to Mitch if I manage to do it quickly enough in his flow of the presentation. And if I miss that, know that we'll catch it at the end. Feel free then to type your questions in as soon as you think of one. Again, everybody will be on mute during this process, but that's how to ask a question. If you're having a problem connecting, you can also ask that question at that Q&A box, and Lori or I will help you behind the scenes. Oops, didn't mean to do that so quickly. Sorry, my typing. Always the question of how do I get a copy of this afterward and share it again. So the link to the handouts and the recording are going to be sent to you if you registered for the webinar right afterward, and you'll be able to see those within a day or so. And then they will also be on our website at isbm.com, and you can see that for the next 30 days. Okay, so a little bit more about us. The ISBM, the Institute for the Study of Business Markets, was founded at Penn State in 1982. And the purpose was that they recognized there was no one point of research for B2B markets. So this group that are facing membership, the folks that are corporate members, exist to accelerate the development and adoption of this innovation and best practices that is done by research through the ISBM at Penn State. So we want to be the organization that you can connect to find the right B2B professionals with information that you need for increasing your growth and improving the profitability of your company. Here are the folks that are part of ISBM, both academically and at the corporate membership level. So I'm Lynn Yanyo and the Executive Director. Many of you will have met Brand Mendez, who is our director and directly involved with member services and bringing you on. Stefan is our new ISBM director in research, and so he's helping figure out where we need to do the research and support that, and also training the young academics that are coming up. Gary Lillian is the previous director who is doing that, so he sits behind Stefan and helps him. Becky Williams is in charge of all of our curriculum, and Ralph Olivia is my past predecessor and executive director at the company interface. We have a whole lot of academics that are attached to us, and this is just a tiny taste of all of the 30 or so distinguished fellows that do research and speak and are at our call if we have questions. We have a whole lot of member companies, and this is again just a little snippet of all of the different member companies that have our members joining with us and getting the benefits of membership, which I won't go into here, but you can see those at isbm.com. And then I just want to make sure that I've put in front of you some things for your calendar. Our next members meeting is September 21, 22, 23 in Houston. It is being hosted for us at ExxonMobil in their world headquarters, which is a fabulous space. And generally the topic area is about measuring, getting data and what the heck to do with it. And I don't know how to make a decision. So what data do I need? And all of that kind of nonsense. We have some courses that are upcoming, and I just want to mention that we had a course that was scheduled in March that many of you might have signed up for, but our coronavirus challenges are causing us to have to cancel some things or postpone them. So the March course that was being held at Swagelok will now be postponed and rescheduled. We're looking at June. We have some other ones that are coming up in June, and what we've decided, because we don't want to be at the whimsy of a virus, we're going to be offering those as online courses on those dates. So even if we cannot get together, we will still deliver the content. So I hope you'll consider competitor analysis and market intelligence, value pricing and strategy, and winning at new products. 3 really great courses by amazing educators. And we will deliver those again by online method for 2 days if we cannot physically get together at that point. So I hope you'll consider that. And then regularly, you can always dial into us and see these webinars, and those are the next webinars that are coming up. So I hope you'll also sign up for those too. All right, so this is my last slide. I'm going to continue talking as Lori switches over to Mitch's slide deck. So Mitch Duckler is from Full Surge, and as I mentioned before, he has a new book out, The Indispensable Brand, and he's been very gracious in being able to take a few snippets of learning from the book and be able to share with us today. I hope you'll also avail yourself of the opportunity to ask him questions as he comes along. There's a little folder with a Q on it that you can then feel free to ask him. And as Mitch takes this over and starts to run, I will turn it over to him. So I'm giving it over to you, Mitch. All right, so Mitch, I'm not hearing you because it looks like you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. There.
Okay, good, thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks for that introduction, Lynn. Yeah, today we want to talk about digital, but one of the things that's interesting about digital is, very often it is very marketing centric, it's very tactical and action oriented, but one of the things that's very often lost in topics or conversations around digital marketing is the role of brand, which is kind of curious because brand, which tends to be so central in almost every other aspect of marketing, somehow seems to take a backseat when it comes to digital. And it is one of the things that I do talk about a lot in my book, The Indispensable Brand, that Lynn mentioned at the outset. A lot of what we'll be talking about today is pulled from the book, and I will be referencing it. But needless to say, you will not have had to have read it to be up to speed on what we're going to be covering today. One of the premises that I talk about, though, in the book is this notion of brand monotony. Call it brand monotony, sea of sameness. I think we all know what we're talking about. Increasingly, in the world of brand marketing, we are living in a world where brands are becoming less distinguishable from one another, even leading brands within categories. And as this slide shows, according to Cantor of Millward Brown, 18%, only 18% of consumers and customers believe that a brand is different. Within any given category, a brand is meaningfully different from others within the category. And as you can see here, that's among consumers or customers that actually find the brand acceptable. So you can imagine the numbers even lower in general when you're talking about customers that are not fans of your brand. So clearly, and you can see the source here, 6,000 brands around the world over a 10-year period. It's a very exhaustive database. What it's telling us is a very disturbing trend, and that is that we are living in this world of brand monotony, and a lack of differentiation really is at the heart of it. And as you can see on the right side of the page, why does it matter? Well, very important metrics such as market capitalization, profit, operating earnings, which is referenced here, are very directly linked to differentiation, and namely brands that are differentiated perform better. They have higher operating earnings than those that are not differentiated and not relevant. In the book, I talk about seven different factors that have led to brand monotony. Technological advances, obviously the internet being at the forefront of that, proliferation of choice, distribution changes, a new media landscape. We've gone from three network television stations to a media landscape that was just, unthinkable 3 decades ago. Proliferation of information, enlightened consumers. We just live in a very different world. And the one common denominator to it is digital technology. And this is not to say that digital and technological advances are bad, all right? In fact, quite the opposite. I think digital technology represents one of the greatest opportunities for brands and brand activation, but it needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed and thought of more strategically than it is today. And here is the book that Lynn mentioned. Again, one of the chapters in the book is around digital activation. But the whole notion of the book is to think about differentiation differently, to identify a positioning or a value proposition that is inherently different from others within the category, and then to have that play out through things like your product service offering, your customer experience, the way you tell your brand story, and yes, digital activation, which is what we'll be talking about today. This is the point I was talking about earlier around marketers who are otherwise very, very strategic and very brand-centric in other aspects of marketing somehow lose those skills when it comes to digital. You can see here what I'm calling the real digital divide. The key to effective digital marketing is having a clear brand positioning. 91% agree to that. I'm surprised that number is not even higher, but still a very high number. But then you see on the other side of the page, the caveat: with the focus on digital social marketing, brand strategy often gets overlooked. 62%, or nearly 2 out of 3 marketers say that. So it's really a very disturbing trend. Again, recognizing the importance of brand in marketing, but saying that when it comes to digital, brand and brand strategy in particular is often overlooked. This is true especially in social media, but even more broadly in content marketing, which we'll be talking about today. So what this means, before we get into this, so what do we do about it, is what we talk about is a vicious cycle. So the average tenure for a CMO has kind of gravitated between 3 and 4 years. I think it's most currently at roughly 44 months. So what does that mean? CMOs and their teams are really being pressured, right? To think more short term. More in terms of tactics, and very often what gets sacrificed is brand, right? We're trying to move the needle on short-term business results at the expense of brand. In turn, then brand relevance is decreasing. When you decrease brand relevance, you reduce your ability to connect effectively with customers. That results obviously in shrinking levels of brand loyalty. We then begin to compete on price. We become commoditized. That puts pressure on growth and profitability, and so on and so on, right? You see we're back to the very top of this page, which is, again, the CMO tenure. So it is a bit of a vicious cycle. And the challenge I think we have is to break these mindsets of short-term thinking only, and to sacrificing brand in the spirit of moving the needle in the short term. So what we're going to focus on today is essentially 3 shifts. Digital is obviously very pervasive. We could talk for the next 3 days about digital marketing and digital activation, but we only have 45 minutes, so we're not going to do that. So instead, we're going to talk about 3 components of digital and the shifts that I propose need to be made to make them more brand-centric: website, content, and social media. So in website, we'll talk about how do you go beyond the latest and greatest in features and functionality, right? We all talk about responsive platform, or what is the latest and greatest in terms of features, and how do we talk about a digital experience that is inspired by your brand positioning? From content, the shift there from conversions and clickbait, right, which again, short-term tactical thinking, to informing and educating customers and building longer term brand equity in the process. And then in social media, I think we can all kind of relate to this in some way, shape, or form, chasing followers and going after shares and comments and likes, which again is the short term and the tactical thinking, to how do we use social media to strengthen customer relationships, and importantly, to do so through the lens of the brand. So these are the three shifts we're going to talk about. What we're not going to talk about today is the latest and greatest of website design or search engine optimization or content marketing social media platforms, but rather each of these in the context of brand strategy, and doing so in a way that is much more consistent with and inspired by your brand positioning. So let's start with brand-centric website design. Again, here, if the from is latest and greatest in features and functionality, and the to is creating a digital experience inspired by brand positioning, I want to talk about two things in particular today. One is aligning your website design and development with your brand positioning, which seems intuitive, right? And it almost seems like it's borderline obvious, but it happens at a shockingly low incidence. So I want to talk about what that means and why it is so important. And the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is the role of brand awareness in the digital space, and how you need to think about increasing your brand's awareness, the level of your brand's awareness, in order to accomplish a lot of the goals that you likely have for your website, especially in terms of traffic. So what are we talking about specifically when we talk about aligning your website with your brand positioning? Think about it in two different components. There's certainly the form of brand position, of your website rather, and that needs to be informed by your brand positioning. And we'll talk about each of these more in the next slide, but we're talking about the look and feel, the color, the expression of your logo, the tone of voice, and is that consistent with your brand identity and your brand positioning, and the emotions. Even in B2B, we talk a lot about the importance of generating the right emotion from all of your communication, but that includes your website as well. And then on the bottom of this screen, when we talk about the function of your website and how that is aligning with your brand positioning, you know, the most obvious place to go is content. We'll spend time talking about content this morning and this afternoon. But the content needs to align with your brand positioning. The layout and the navigation needs to make sense. And then the channels for distribution, especially your social media, need to make sense for who your brand is and how it's being positioned in the market. So let's talk about these concepts in a little bit more detail. So your website and brand positioning, again, think about in terms of form and functionality. The three that I mentioned on the previous page: color, tone of voice, and emotion. So are you choosing colors that are not necessarily the latest and greatest or the most trendy, if you will, in terms of website design, which is very often what your website designer may talk to your team about. But are you actually using a color scheme, color palettes that are very consistent with your identity system, with your core values as well? Your tone of voice, it's something, again, that seems so obvious, but you'd be surprised how often tone of voice is not consistent on a website with the tone of voice of other communication forms. So when you look at your website, does it seem consistent with the way you talk about your brand in promotion, in advertising, at trade shows, in your collateral? And very often when we work with our clients, we see a disconnect. There is a separate tone of voice that we see in their communication, for instance, at trade shows or marketing collateral, than we see on their website. Again, very inexplicable, and something that's relatively easy to correct once you're aware of it. And then again, emotions. So your brand should be associated with certain emotional benefits, if you will. And we want to make sure that that's reflected in your brand too. And again, on the right side of the page, your function. So is the content that you're generating consistent not only with audience interests, right, which is very important, right? We're not saying don't produce content that your audience isn't interested in. But as we'll talk about later, it needs to be content that's also consistent with your brand identity, and more specifically, your brand promise. That is how you are going to reinforce the strength of your brand. Layout and navigation, again, this is not a how-to of website design and layout, but there are best practices for logo and tagline placement in hot zone areas of the website in order to increase brand recognition. And then, which we'll talk about when we get to the social media module later today, making sure that in particular you're on the right channels and the right social media platforms. So one example, again, now this is going to go to the B2C space, but it's equally relevant in B2B, and Wolverine brand. When you take a look at their website, you can see elements of all the things we just talked about. These are all components that emanate from this brand's positioning and value proposition. Their purpose is reflected. You can see through brand story, their history being told. You can even see their positioning overtly stated. So think about that for your own sites, especially in a B2B context. Does it make sense to be very overt about your value proposition? Very often value proposition is something that's thought about as internal speak, right? It's an internal tool, but sometimes it may make sense, especially if it is written in a way that is very consistent with external communication, to represent that value proposition or positioning and be very overt about it in your external communication, such as your website. The second thing we want to talk about is awareness, the importance of building your brand awareness online. And I think for those of you on the call, you may have varying levels of understanding or mastering of search engine optimization, but there is kind of a shift in the way Google is treating search. And they are more and more beginning to reward brands that have higher click-through rates. The click-through rates on searches is actually beginning to inform your search engine ranking, which is on the far right. So that, and what is something that drives high click-through rate, as we'll talk about in a minute, that tends to be just the sheer recognition of your brand. Does your brand have recognition? You may be lower on a search, a Google search, but if you have higher brand awareness, you're going to get chosen over a brand that is above you. And that's really what is coming across here. Is you need to very proactively build your brand in the online space and begin to proactively manage your reputation in search. And there's a few ways you can do that. Building very strong external profile pages. If this is something you haven't done, and it's equally important in B2B as it is in B2C, if you haven't done this, this is one way you begin to increase the performance of your brand in search engine, as well as what comes to the very top when your brand is searched. Distributing press releases is another way. Obviously, getting interviewed as subject matter experts in your respective spaces. Something very often overlooked, building strong internal links within the site can go a long way. And then consider buying your brand name. You can see on the far left what IBM is doing here. This is from a search on IBM. You can see the very first thing that pops up is an ad from IBM itself. So this is one of the largest, most recognizable brands in the world, buying its own name in part to control and to influence its search engine rank and how it's viewed online. Branded links is another way to do this. Again, building your reputation or your brand online through establishing branded links. So we're all familiar with Bitly and other forms that of ways of reducing the size of links. But if you're not already doing this, it's something you absolutely should be doing, is learning how to brand your links, right? When you do that, you build your brand's prominence over the web. You can begin to assimilate some of the keywords you're trying to own and associate them with your brand. You can see how it's being done on the left with New York Times as the example. NYTI, this is their way of not just shortening the link and making it more user-friendly, but building their presence in an online environment. You should be using these on author bio pages when submitting guest blogs, if you're being interviewed, if you're writing articles. Also, as we talked about earlier, if you're creating profiles online in web directories, geospecific web directories, these are all places that branded links should be used and leveraged if they're not currently. These are fairly easy ways, again, just to build that awareness. As we talked about earlier, the stronger your awareness, the more likely you are to be clicked, even when you are lower in a search, right? The higher your click-through rate, and then again, it just is a circle. Google will begin to reward you through better placement. So I'll try to pause in between sessions. If there are questions regarding the individual modules, please let me know or chime in through Lynn.
Yeah, so hi, Mitch.
Hi.
This was really, really instructive because I've already got a page full of things that I need to do now, including
Okay, good.
idea. And maybe you'll get to this, but it made me pause when you had the slide there around social media and funnel conversations, that a lot of us have to support our organizations by reporting back to them our successes in some way. Sometimes it's, the number of likes, or it's how our funnel conversions are going. And that may drive this short-term view or the less than strategic look. Can you just speak to how we can manage the organization or change their expectations as well as do the right things?
Sure. No, yeah, it's a great question, Lynn. I think it's one of these situations where it's not in either or. So the last thing I want to suggest is that driving short-term tactics and business results, like customer acquisition, like driving traffic, like building engagement on social media through increased followers, and that stuff is all important to do. What I'm not trying to imply that we shouldn't be striving towards those ends, and I think that is a lot of what management is looking for. They're looking for what is our ROI on content marketing, on social media, et cetera. What I'm suggesting is that it needs to be done in a more thoughtful way, or over time, it will begin to denigrate the brand. So continue to focus on the metrics that your management cares about. And the more quantifiable, the better. And a lot of this is quantifiable, right? But do so in a way that is also reinforcing your brand. And that's really the message. It's no different than any other form of marketing, right? In advertising, you're not just trying to build awareness, but you're trying to do so in a way that's consistent with your brand positioning. For some reason, it's very intuitive in advertising or communication in general, but when it comes to digital, it sometimes gets overlooked.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Let's talk about content marketing now, and how do we make that a little bit more brand-centric. So here, let's just start with the basics, right? Brand strategy. If brand strategy is the blueprint for how you build and grow your brand, content strategy is a way, right, to execute your brand strategy. It's a communication tool. What is surprising is, like what we've been talking about up until now, and we talked about in the website module, there is often a disconnect between brand strategy and content strategy, which is very puzzling. You can see it here, 37%, it's the very concerning stat on the left, is only roughly 1 in 3 marketers actually have a formal content strategy. So if you don't even have a content strategy to begin with, it's very difficult to make sure it's aligned with brand. But even those that do have it, they say that they're only a third say that they really focus on their brand when creating content. And I think a lot of that has been reinforced through content marketing agencies who instruct us to focus on customers, right? Which we absolutely should, right? What are customers interested in? What are they striving for? What do they want to know? What do they want to learn? And that is absolutely important, but it's only half the equation. The other half of the equation is to do so in a way that is consistent with your brand and begins to shift the dialogue in the content world towards your brand. So here is one of these pages that's a very gross generalization. B2B and B2C, companies within each of those two columns are very significantly, but here's some generalizations or rules of thumb. When you are in a B2B space, as we all are on this call, your value proposition is very often solution focused. It's very often focused on business needs, less so around personal preferences, which is the right side of the page, right? Styles, trends. You can't go wrong in B2B when you're focusing on pain points or resolving problems. And your messaging should be very much about articulating business value, service, and quality. It tends to be, again, not that it's devoid of emotion, as I said earlier, but it does tend to be a little bit more rational than emotional. So this is probably not overly surprising, but it's just reinforcing that a lot of the concepts that you think about when you develop your value proposition, when you develop any kind of communication, whether it's advertising, trade show, marketing collateral, very, very similar tenets apply here in terms of the nature of your content. So two things I want to talk about in terms of brand-centric content marketing. Again, when you get into my book, there's a lot of others, and just for the sake of time, we can't talk about them all. So the two I chose to talk about here are share your brand story and build brand pillars. Again, how do we think about not thinking about conversions and clickbait, right? That's important. But also, while doing so, reinforcing your brand, building long-term brand equity, and informing and educating customers along the way. So let's talk about each of these. Your brand story is just a great source for content marketing. And I think it's one of the most under-leveraged tools in content marketing in both B2B and B2C. Power of brand storytelling. 80% of people, and by the way, in B2B, your customers are people, right? So this is equally relevant across B2B and B2C. 80% of people say they want brands to tell them stories, yet 85% can't remember a good one. Right, so that's a huge opportunity. People are we are wired as human beings to respond positively and favorably to brands, to story. And it's no different in the world of business and brand. Huge undertapped potential. If you are able to tell your story in a way that is compelling, you will break through the clutter, that monotony that I talked about earlier. You will build the emotional engagement and achieve a lot of the objectives that we have in digital and in brand and marketing overall. One of the questions I get often are, what is a good brand story? Where does it come from? What inspires it? How should I think about it? And, here are, a few that I think, a few that really represent the sources of or inspiration for brand strategy. You think about, brand story. Think about your origin, right? So Hewlett-Packard is a great example. My guess is I could take off the logos on the bottom of this page for all three of these, and the stories are so powerful and so well known that you would probably know the brand even without it, right? So we all kind of know Hewlett-Packard was found in this garage, right? This woodshed or garage in Silicon Valley, and it's been the inspiration for innovation ever since. And they talk about this actual site and Hewlett-Packard being the birthplace of Silicon Valley. So that's just one example of this multi-billion-dollar international company, going back to their origin as their source for brand story. A lot of companies in both B2B and B2C talk about their purpose, All right, there's been a lot of talk. I'm sure all of you on this call, this webinar, are familiar with the notion of purpose branding, and that's really what this is. Identifying what your purpose, your mission is, and using that as leverage for your brand story. So Patagonia, they're all about save our planet. And they go as far as saying, don't buy this jacket. Obviously, what they're saying is you aren't buying a jacket, you're not buying a product, you're not buying a manufactured good, you're not buying a chemical, whatever it may be in your business, you're kind of buying into a bigger purpose. SAP is an example of a company that does that. They talk a lot about solving the world's problem. Again, a B2B company, SAP, that is going beyond their services that they provide and talking about what their purpose or their mission is in business. And again, and granted, this is purely on the B2C side on the far right of the page, make customers the hero. So the more you're able to showcase your customers, whether it's through case studies or what have you, testimonials, that is a great source for brand story. Do you have cases, customer success stories, where you're not making yourself the hero, right? You're the enabler, but you're showcasing your customers as a way to tell your brand story. You're making them heroes in the process. Again, all great sources for brand story. The second thing I want to talk about under the content marketing, guys, is build brand pillars. And here's the point I was talking about earlier. It's not either or, it's and. So of course, you absolutely have to think about what does your audience care about? What are their information needs? What are they craving to hear from you or others like you? But you need to overlay that with your brand promise and your brand positioning. Otherwise, if you don't, you may be giving them content, but it's going to be lost in the fray. It's going to look like everyone else's content. It won't do much to begin to separate you from the pack, and it won't do much to elevate you as a thought leader or as in terms of a competitive advantage in your space, because it won't be ownable to your brand. So yes, you do need to produce content that is of value and that your audience cares about, but you need to do so within the context of your brand pillars. So let's talk about brand pillars. And again, this may be content that you're familiar with, it may not. It's getting a lot of traction lately in the world of content marketing, but it is this notion of being much more disciplined about the content you're producing. Start with your brand. Identify 2 or 3 pillars, if you will. Think of keywords, maybe 2 to 3 keywords that are central to your brand promise, your positioning, your value proposition, however you have it defined. Think about 2 or 3 of those, and then begin to develop clusters around those. So what are different areas that people have interests on, which are those content clusters, the outer ring of this diagram. And then from there, begin to build out the individual content pieces, right? Whether it's an infographic, a video, a blog post, an article, whatever the case may be. You start at a very high level with a brand pillar, right? Which at most you have maybe 2 or 3, maybe a few more, but typically think in terms of 3, no more than 5. Then build out these content clusters and then the content pieces beneath them. You can see when you do this, you begin to develop much more focus. You begin to build critical mass around things that you're trying to own from a brand perspective. So on the left side of this page, you can see how it's done traditionally, where you might have a blog and you have a number of different topics and they may or may not be related, and you've got pieces beneath them that again may or may not be interrelated. When you think about it in terms of pillars though, you begin to be much more disciplined. You have different topics that again are aligned with pillars from your brand. They're consistent with your brand. They're still useful to the site visitors. But the other big advantage here is you begin to become recognized by Google and search engines in general as a subject matter expert, and something that as an expert on that particular pillar, you begin to own that from a search engine perspective. So it's really kind of a win-win-win. It helps promote your brand. it's the way consumers and customers are consuming information and content, and it's going to be recognized and rewarded by Google. So an example of this, so if physical fitness, for example, is a brand pillar, you can, and you might have, there might be one of 3 or 4 pillars. But if you think about that, how do you then take and begin to dissect that? Well, you could say, all right, if physical fitness is the pillar, we could start talking about how do you begin a routine? What are the benefits of cardio versus strength training? What are correlations between fitness and longevity? How do you overcome common obstacles to exercise? How do you incorporate fitness into an active lifestyle? What's the role of nutrition in achieving fitness? Those are all offshoots, if you will. What do they have in common? They're all about one brand pillar, one component of your pillar, your proposition, which is fitness. But they all come at it from a different angle, but a very highly interrelated, interlinked angle. Then you can start to see, okay, well, we take each one of those sub-pillars, if you will, or content pieces, and then start developing content around it. So an infographic, a blog post, an instructional video, etc. It begins to take, again, that pillar, breaks it down into subcomponents, and that should inform the content you're developing. So again, I'll pause here if there's any questions around content, any of the things we talked about.
Just a comment that, exactly as you said, when you showed that item on the left of, here are all the things I've written, and it's all in one big collection, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Although we all go at it that way, and it seems to be so insightfully obvious that doing it by the method which is structured with the pillars and then building around each pillar, that just seems so much more structured. I can't explain why I've never really thought about that either. I mean, I've been down the traditional side. Maybe it's because some days it's so hard to generate content, to find the time to generate content in all of the other things we do, right?
Yeah.
That just getting anything done feels great.
Yep.
So just put it in the bucket, right? As opposed to being purposeful and setting aside the time and the resources and arguing for the resources to generate all the content. If I could offer one thing maybe in that thought process for our B2B folks, if you're in the technical space, one would never go forward and design a physical technical product without a specifications sheet and a lot of detail under all of that. So we spend all that time in the product engineering, but when it comes to communicating, we'd spend very little of that time in that structure, right? And making sure that we've got our specification, our brand pillar set, and we understand what we're trying to communicate. And if that's any help for how people might argue for more resources, right? Because the engineers seem to always get the resources. Yeah.
No, I'd agree, Lynn. I think it's a great point. And I would say even more specifically within digital, right? So
specifically for digital, yes.
Exactly. There does seem to be more discipline when it's other forms of communication. Again, whether it's a trade promotion, a print advertising campaign, or marketing collateral, that strategic thinking, that brand centricity is there.
Yeah.
Or more often, at least more often than it is in digital. But for some reason, when it comes to digital, I'd like to say, I don't mean to be condescending towards my own webinar, but there's a lot of this is a lot of common sense. There's nothing new here. It's one of these things that's simple but not easy. Yeah. And I kind of go back to here, the very beginning here. When you don't even have a content strategy to begin with, I mean, you're kind of at a huge disadvantage. Right. So you need to be more strategic about it. You need to have a content strategy, and then make sure that it is brand centric.
And so I wonder if that is just the aging out of the knowledge space and us having people coming in and spending more time in digital and knowing it. I remember always having somebody that has 25 years of experience in running a trade show, being part of the trade show scene, but you could never get that level of depth of experience in digital. It didn't exist long enough. So maybe it will improve itself over time just by having that knowledge. But the flip side is, of course, when I do a trade show spend, I have to send money outside of the company, and I better know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Whereas in digital, it almost seems free,
Yeah.
but it's not, right. And
It's
it's
not,
certainly,
right.
its value isn't low if you do it right. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's a great point.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll go fast forward. And in the time that remains, we'll take the last component, which is social media. So here, social media again is this probably is not shocking, but it's what I like to say is pervasive, and it's mobile, right? And that includes in B2B and B2C, and that's one of the things that I think is maybe not intuitive, that even in B2B, this is becoming, social media is a necessary evil, if you will, and it's becoming more and more mobile by the day. So you can see here, this is across B2B and B2C actually, percent of active users who say they use social platforms in some way, shape, or form to research products. Those aren't insignificant numbers, percentages. And I think equally important is percentage of users, again, this is across all businesses, who are likely to purchase from a brand they follow. So, to your point, Lynn, about the stakes here, there is a correlation between brands that you follow and brands that you are purchasing from and or loyal to. So here again, we see some of the same disturbing metrics or statistics that we did back in content marketing. 77% of marketers use at least one social network platform to promote their brand, right? But 48%, nearly 1 in 2, say that they don't really see any return on investment. Another disturbing following, it's not a huge number, but still too high. 30% of people have unfollowed a brand because the content doesn't fit with the brand. So what these things are saying is, social media is here to stay. I think there is a role, and a very positive and productive role, for social media in marketing and specifically in B2B, but it's something that we just still haven't perfected, still haven't been able to get on top of. So here again, this is going to fall into that bucket of common sense, and it's simple but not easy. One is just thinking about your platform, and the other, which is really, really important, and something that I think is easier said than done, but humanize your brand, right? And it is the whole notion, I'm sure you've heard it. I mean, social media is social, right? That's the word. That's one of the two words in that handle, social media. And yet, brands are very often not personalizing, they're not humanizing their brands when it comes to social media. So let's talk about each one of these. You can start to see the social media platforms that you're currently using. So you can see this is across B2B and B2C in total. I think there's a couple of points here that jump out. There's a lot of platforms out there, and a lot of them are being used, and a lot of them are being used, including Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube by B2B specifically. I think the key message here again is what's in the call out: choose fewer platforms and engage at higher levels. This is one of those situations where you can do more harm than good by being on a platform, right? A lot of brands, including in the B2B space, feel that, what, I need to be on just because I need to be on, right? Because that's what you do, right? We're in marketing, and our competitors are on Twitter, our competitors are on LinkedIn or Facebook, therefore we need to be as well. And that's not necessarily the case. What's more important is to be very active, and to be active in a very brand relevant way on the platforms that you're on, even if that means choosing to proactively be on fewer platforms. So again, these are some generalizations, but think about as you think about the platforms that you are on and or need to be on, or if you're debating continuing to be on them, these platforms, yes, they all fit under the guise of social media, but they really are very, very different, and not just in terms of the audiences that they appeal to. In fact, more and more the audiences are beginning to blur, and across B2B and B2C, and you are starting to see platforms that most people might have traditionally thought of as consumer-oriented platforms crossing over to the B2B space. What isn't changing as much, though, is what these platforms specialize in for, or what they can offer your business and your brand, and the downsides or limitations they have, right? So there are certain ones that are really loyalty oriented, others that are better for lead generation, some are better for, again, just building reputation, enhancing public relation. It all starts, again, with more strategic thinking. What is your role? What is your goal for being in social media in general and on a particular platform? Can you articulate that goal or goals? It doesn't have to be singular. And then which platforms make most sense? Again, not just with the audience, not just with what your brand represents, but also with what you're trying to achieve from being on that platform in the first place. So said differently, it's really kind of a very simple three-step process, right? Identify your audience and align your audience, right? Their demographic, their psychographic, their needs, their behaviors, identify them with your individual audience, with the platforms, right? Define your goals, as we just talked about a moment ago. Why are you on a particular platform? And maybe you have, in fact, you probably would have different goals for different platforms. Maybe you're looking just to build awareness, brand awareness and reputation through one, but you're using another one for acquisition or higher levels of engagement, and that's fine. But just know what those goals are, and then you begin to align steps 1 and 2, right? So you look for fit between audience and platform, your platform and brand, and the platforms and the goals you have for your brand. So the second point here, again, humanize the brand. This is the social aspect. So 35% of people feel brands do not show any personality on their social media accounts. I don't have the breakout, unfortunately, for B2B versus B2C. My guess, my hunch, is that this number is even higher in the B2B space. I think we are, within the world of B2B, even more cautious, more conservative, in social media than our B2C counterparts. And you know, even if you do maintain levels of professionalism and conservatism, which may be appropriate for some of your spaces, you still need to personify. You still need to show that there are human beings behind the social media interactions, and that that the people who are consuming the social media or interacting with it are human as well. So just humanizing and making it personal, as we like to say, are really critical. And there are different ways to do this. And these are just a few, but showcase your leadership team is one very simple way. Actually, these first two are very simple. Making sure that your leadership team is on social media, that they are prepared to interact in ways, at least in select ways, if not more profound ways on social media, and that they have a voice. So again, it's not just this amorphous type brand, right? But there are people behind the scenes, including your leaders, that have personalities and that stand behind the brand. Go behind the scenes. There's, customers want to see a kind of a peek behind the tent, if you will, a day in the life. You understand what it is that makes your organization tick. Again, don't be afraid to show your mission, your vision, your purpose, especially when that's important. That's every bit as relevant here in social media as it was when we talked about it in content marketing. Don't be afraid to take a stance. I think that's hard for marketers, especially B2B marketers, but social media, I mean, we live in an increasingly polarized society, and it's equally relevant in B2B as it is in B2C. Brands that take a stand without being offensive or alienating, right? We're not saying, be confrontational and provocative, but don't be afraid to have a stance in your social media and to have points of view and express those points of view consistently. don't post like a marketer, bottom left corner here. That's probably one of the biggest sins, and we see that even in B2C, but especially in B2B. It feels very corporate, and that is the last thing that people are looking for on social media, including coming from a brand or from a company account. Again, that personification, posting, commenting, engaging in general, like a human being as opposed to a marketer is really critical. And then acknowledge mistakes. So, social media is one of the best ways to do that. If there is a misstep, if there is a public, a PR snafu, if you will, social media is one of the easiest and the first places you may want to go in order to correct those, to admit that you made a mistake, show that, show that you are human. Humans and brands make mistakes, and kind of take accountability for them. You can see some examples here, just again, the one on the left is in a B2C space, but you see, don't post like a marketer. Chick-fil-A, for those of you not familiar, they're a fast food chain that is based in the South, and they are not open on Sundays. They say, is there anything better than enjoying one of our spicy chicken sandwiches on a Friday afternoon? Wendy's comes out and says, yeah, enjoying one of ours on a Sunday when Chick-fil-A is closed. So I think there's a couple things here that you see there. Again, they're not posting like a marketer. They're talking like human beings. They're not afraid to take a stance and even to kind of poke fun at one of their competitors. They're not playing it safe. And they're being consistent and true to their brand. Showcasing your leadership team. And again, this is a brand that goes both B2B and B2C, but John Leisure, the CEO, is very active. He on social media, on Twitter in particular, and he is showcased both on T-Mobile, which is his brand, as well as in his personal account. 3 out of 4 consumers say that CEO's presence on social media makes the brand more trustworthy. Again, a lot of upside potential to showcasing your leadership within social media. So I kind of raced through a lot of that. It's a lot of content, a huge, broad topic, I know. The role of digital, but again, if I were to kind of sum it up in one final message, it is don't forget about your brand. And as obvious and intuitive as it sounds, it is something that's happening on a daily basis, and in marketing in general, but probably more so in digital than anywhere. So a lot of the same tenets apply to digital and apply to other forms of marketing. You need to lead with strategy for sure. But even more specifically, brand strategy. And that's something that just isn't happening to a high enough occurrence today.
So thank you, Mitch. I'll just put a note out for folks that are still listening. If you have a question, feel free. I'm going to talk for another minute or so before the top of the hour. So one thing I would say, Mitch, is that there are a few slides in there that where back in my corporate office, I would want to print them out and laminate them and put them on the wall. Yeah. So yeah. One of them, if you didn't catch these as you were listening, was the one that was the comparison of the social platforms. I think another challenge we have in B2B is that all of these social media platforms are well known to everyone. So you get lots of advice from folks that don't know what you do for a living necessarily in your B2B world that says, but why aren't you folks on Facebook? You don't have a Facebook page? Why don't you? Right? Mm-hmm. These kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. And I think that the downside row was like really helpful to me. Mm-hmm. that it says, oh, I know how to answer this now, right? Yes, it would be valuable, but in the grand scheme of things, when you say focus on a few and go deep on each, yes, right? So although I've heard other advice that says, take that content and make sure you use it over and over again at all of your platforms. Get all the work, all you can out of that same bit of content, which becomes, in my mind, a little stale too, but it's, you know, it is consistent. So I think all of this is great. I can't take enough of it in 1 hour. But Becky Williams, who does our education programs, and I've read your book, and we just like ate it up. One, we like organizations of stuff, so that's part of it. So I'm going to do another pitch for that book, and hope that you'll join us at some point. I think it would be fabulous, maybe if we could have maybe a workshop discussion.
Absolutely, would love to.
Yeah, so looking for feedback from those of you that watch the video live now or in the future. Feel free to email us at ISBM through our website, isbm.com, or reach out to Mitch. We've left his email up here too if you want to talk to him directly. So thanks again for a really great webinar. I learned so much, Mitch. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, and then we'll sign off. Thank you, Lori. Are we off?
I think so.
Waiting for the all clear from Lori.